Hello everyone, and welcome to Summit 2020 by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The Summit is a platform where innovators, leaders, and pioneers share their perspectives on how to best build an economy that is resilient and regenerative by design. My name's Cindy, and I'm part of the Insight and Analysis team here at the Foundation, and I'm going to be hosting this session for you today on exploring the role of bio-based materials in a circular economy. Currently, many of the everyday products we engage with are made from finite resources, which are pollutive and quickly reaching their limits. As a result, more and more people and companies are looking to biology to satisfy their future material needs. We too at the Foundation have spent the past few months delving into the world of bio-based materials and investigating questions such as what exactly are these materials, what opportunities and challenges do they present, and how can they contribute to the creation of an economy that is at the same time thriving as well as able to function within the means of our planet. To help us in answering some of these questions today, I'm joined by two guests who are experts in the field of bio-based materials. I'm excited to introduce you to our first guest, PhD and Associate Professor in Materials Science and Technology, Paola Fabbri from the University of Bologna. Welcome, Paola.
Good morning. Thanks for your invitation.
Great. Thanks. Great to have you. So the session's called Exploring the Role of Bio-Based Materials in a Circular Economy. But before we start thinking about what role these materials have in a circular economy, I was wondering if you could set the context a little bit for us about what are we talking about today? What are bio-based materials?
For sure, because definitions are very important in this field, and a lot of misalignment and confusion is also due to the fact that clear, univoc, global definitions are lacking. So it's very important to start saying what a bio-based material is, because it's currently simply called biomaterial. But biomaterial is very generic and means multiple things. So a bio-based material is a material which is obtained starting from renewable resources. A material is not a chemical in itself, a chemical substance. A material is something that we can use for production of goods. So inside a material, we have different chemicals, different components, and we can have bio-based materials which are fully deriving from renewable resources, 100%. But we can also have bio-based materials which are just partially coming from renewable resources, sometimes just 2, 3, 5% by weight or by volume, depending. So bio-based material is a wide definition, but in general terms, it indicates a material that is produced starting from raw materials or chemicals obtained from renewable resources. Most commonly, these are biomasses. Cellulosic biomasses or agro-wastes, agro-products or agro-wastes, and algae, so microorganisms, bacteria, which are very nice and very precise producers of biomaterials. So under the term bio-based material, several different options are collected, and we always need to have these, to keep these in mind, because mainly for communication purposes, the term bio-based material, or more simply biomaterial, is sometimes abused.
Right, and I think that's something that a lot of people, I know I wasn't familiar with before we started researching this, is that there is kind of a lack of this universal definition. But it's interesting that there is so much variety, right? That you can use, these waste streams or, grow agricultural biomass for the production of these materials. But in terms of this kind of misunderstanding, I guess, that there is around bio-based materials, another thing that I think is quite commonly associated with bio-based materials is that they are good, or at least better for the environment than the finite sourced materials that they replace. Is this true, or is this another misconception?
So it is not always true, and not always true, because to understand if one material is somehow better than another one, for instance, its fossil-based counterpart, we need to take into account the whole value chain, the whole life cycle of that material. We need to evaluate the advantages, but also disadvantages in terms of sustainability, emissions, usage of natural resources, also spoilage of other natural resources like water, for instance, to produce the material. But also the length of the life of the material impacts on its sustainability. So the durability, the so-called durability, for how long we can use that material. And then the processing techniques, which strongly impact economic sustainability at the industrial level. If the material can be processed in similar conditions or in completely different, worse or better conditions at the industrial level. And then sustainability is also impacted by end-of-life management options. What can we do with that material when it becomes a waste? So in order to evaluate if the bio-based alternative is really better or worse with respect to a fossil-based counterpart, we need to enter into a deep evaluation of all the steps that altogether constitute the life cycle of that material and the value chain. For some materials, this is relatively easy to make this comparison. These are the so-called bio-based drop-ins. Things that we have we can have exactly the same material, but coming from renewable resources or fossil resources. But the product is absolutely the same. One example, which is very common, is biopolyethylene, bio-PE, which is a commodity plastic mainly used for packaging application. It is completely coming from renewable resources, but as a material, it is exactly identical in its transformation, usage, end-of-life treatment, exactly the same as fossil-based polyethylene. So the comparison of these kind of bio-based materials, so-called drop-ins, so substitutes, identical substitutes of traditional material, the comparison is relatively easy. There are methods, numerical methods of assessment for the evaluation of their impact and sustainability, like LCA, life cycle assessment methods. It is more difficult for bio-based materials which do not have a fossil-based, a traditional counterpart, because you lack your term of comparison.
And I think that's really interesting that you mentioned that there are these identical replacement. You could have the exact same material properties for a bio-based material as for instance, a fossil-derived one. But then you also mentioned that there's these other types of materials that can be quite different than from, I guess, what they would be an alternative for in the fossil world. Do you have any sense of when would you go for a more of a drop-in solution, as you say, or more of a distinctly different bio-based material? Is there any rules for that?
Well, for some situations, using drop-in solutions makes the commercial, the industrial uptake of this new solution much faster, because the technology for that material was already developed in the past for the traditional counterpart. So everything is ready for its usage. People know, people is familiar, consumers are familiar with that material. So this is commonly a faster uptake, easier uptake. But some completely new bio-based bio-based materials, offer additional functionalities, new functionalities that are simply not offered by any traditional counterpart. For instance, to make it easy to understand, compostable plastics. Nowadays, we have huge amounts of plastics plastic waste that need to be treated somehow to reduce the amount of plastic waste, which unfortunately is not valorized, and also in large portion ends up in the ocean, in the natural environment. So compostable plastics are plastic which are coming from biotechnology very often, and which are able to undergo a very specific kind of biodegradation in industrial sites, so under controlled, managed conditions. These are very important solutions, which are new, which are not offered by several other traditional alternatives. So advantages or disadvantages of using droppings alternatives or completely new really strictly depends on the specific field of application.
Right. I think that's a very valid point to bring out, that you need to, as you say earlier on, you need to take this whole value chain approach and really think about how are you extracting that biomass and how are you processing it, and then what's that end of life, what's the application, and where will that material end up, to ensure that if you are trying to adopt more bio-based solutions, you can do this in a way that actually is then superior to the finite. But there is a lot of innovation happening in the field of bio-based materials. And actually, Paola, you were involved in writing a paper for the European Commission, which was on the top emerging bio-based products, their properties and industrial applications. And here you outline the 20 most innovative bio-based products in Europe. I wondered if you could share a little bit for us about what sort of innovations are out there now. And you've mentioned a few examples already of the bioplastics, either the drop-ins or novel, but are there other innovations that you'd like to share, and why are they particularly exciting?
Yeah, that study was one part of a larger tender study made for the European Commission. We understood very rapidly that there was a huge amount of researcher, people, companies working in this field, interested in this field, and very active. We were able to map more than 100 innovative products under development, coming from biomass components, which are sometimes very easily and widely available in large volumes, like natural rubber, plant fibers, oils, vegetable oils, animal fats, lignin. But also people is developing new solutions coming from low volume but very high intrinsic value components of biomasses, like terpenes, polyelectrolytes. So these are parts of several kinds of biomasses and can find very high added value application in biomedical sectors, pharma sectors, food sectors. So they really bring a lot of value on the market. We also investigated what is going on in the field of the valorization of urban waste. So the organic fraction of municipal solid waste, but also urban wastewater. It was incredibly interesting to see that more than 19 new products are under development, and most probably in the next 5 to 10 years, these products will arrive to be fully developed at the industrial scale, so available for the people, coming from urban waste. We also understood that biotechnology, biotech engineering is playing a key role in the development of new bio-based materials through, I would say, an innovative approach, which is a light approach, low impact approach. Fermentation, for instance, is very used for many products as the technology of production, but also standard chemistry. The old standard chemistry, traditional chemistry, is still playing a key role. We really realized that there's a lot of attention, a lot of work undergoing on the raw materials, on the technology, on the final product, so for the consumer, and also in the end-of-life treatments. So it was really an interesting study.
Yeah, and I think having such a comprehensive overview as well of all these different innovations that are happening, and as you say, like in terms of both the different feedstocks that or resources that you're using, but also this processing that it's both conventional chemistry as well as biotechnology that are playing a role. That's really interesting. We also wondered, because you have this broad overview of what innovations are happening, and given how we at the Foundation talk about a circular economy as one that designs out waste and pollution, keeps materials and products in use, and regenerates natural systems, how do you see these new bio-based materials fitting into that vision of a circular economy?
They represent, I think, they play a key role. They represent the solution for multiple problems, multiple aspects. They are not, for sure, the solution to all the problems of the traditional linear economy, for sure, but they can offer so many advantages from different perspectives that we really need to evaluate their potential to contribute to the passage from a linear to a circular economy. For instance, let's start from the very beginning of the value chain, so the raw materials. The fact of using renewable sources, renewable biomasses, means that on an annual or biannual basis, we can regenerate what we need to produce these materials. When we are able to transform these materials through sustainable biotechnological processing, we also contribute to the overall reduction of the impact of the industrial sites of the industrial processing. And also wastes. For a bio-based material, it is absolutely not obvious to be biodegradable. Biodegradability is an additional functionality. It's something that a bio-based material can have, can show, can offer. This just depends on the chemical composition, the chemical structure of the bio-based material, and on the conditions of treatment. But these additional option of recycling, of valorization of a waste, of an end-of-life product, strongly contributes to the achievement of the targets of the circular economy. We need to work on the production, so on the origin, finding new materials, new biomasses, new components which can be exploited on the industrial level to produce new bio-based renewable materials, all the value chain and the end of life, which also offer, for instance, the opportunity through composting to give back very important chemical elements to the soil, carbon, nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen, and so on. So we have a real chance to regenerate natural systems, mainly the soil, to give back carbon to the environment through compostable, biodegradable materials, for instance. So this is, I think, a concrete, relevant opportunity, and we need to catch this opportunity.
Yeah, no, that's greatly put. So really this sort of design, making sure that you're designing these bio-based materials so that they do fit this vision of a circular economy, then you can, make use of these different waste sources and keep them in circulation if that's what you want to, if you want the durability, or alternatively think about how you can biodegrade or compost them so that you regenerate. That's great. Thanks so much, Paola, for taking the time to talk to us today. This has been really valuable.
It was my pleasure. Thanks again.
Great, thank you. So now that we've heard a bit more about the general landscape of bio-based materials, let's delve in a bit deeper into the themes of biotechnology and bioengineering. Here to help guide us through this conversation is our next guest, Charles Zimmer, CEO and co-founder of Checkerspot, a high-performance materials company designing materials at a molecular level. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. So we're going to be talking in a bit more about what exactly you do at Checkerspot. But first, to kind of set the context, we're also going to be talking with you a lot about biotechnology in that field. And at Checkerspot, you work within biotechnology, bioengineering, and of course, bio-based materials. What is it that you find particularly exciting about these areas?
Well, the innovation platform that we're developing at Checkerspot rests on three functional areas. The cornerstone is biotechnology, as you were describing, and we're working with microbes, and more specifically, microalgae in a biomanufacturing context, fermentation, so large-scale commercial production, leveraging microalgae to produce novel monomers. And in our case, we're producing oils or triglycerides. The second part of the platform is polymer chemistry. It's material science, and we're assembling those monomers, those triglycerides, into performance materials. And we've started with two specific types of materials, one being urethanes and the second being textile finishes. And then third and finally, we have an applications or a prototyping capability to build end-use consumer products that based on materials, these performance materials coming from the innovation platform. So to answer your question, Cindy, what excites me the most about what we're doing is, number one, tapping into a natural biodiversity that exists in nature on the earth for building blocks, monomers that really haven't been explored before, that haven't been accessed by the petrochemical industry or by the oleochemical industry, because you weren't able to access these monomers at scale. And that's fundamentally what biotechnology unlocks, is the ability to tap into that natural biodiversity. There's an added benefit that being able to source these materials and the way that we do it is much more attractive from an environmental and sustainability perspective relative to, say, petroleum, or relative to some of the commodity-based vegetable oils. Palm oil rapidly comes to mind. But the second thing that really excites me is how we're working with the customer in mind. We're working with a design-centric mentality, thinking about the problem that we're looking to solve, defining that problem, and then working backwards to the technology platform to solve that problem. And we're doing this with an applications focus and integrating the full stack of Checkerspot's innovation platform to do that cost effectively. And when we look at the broader petrochemical industry as an example, we're seeing less and less innovation creating new things because we've exhausted what's possible with the different permutations of what's available with petroleum-based feedstocks. And that presents an opportunity for us to do things better and in a more focused way.
Right. And I think that's really exciting what you say there about, so what we've already done with all these fossil materials that we have is we've sort of tapped out that innovation, as you say, but that biology has a lot more potential, I guess, in it to innovate. And I like the way that you say that biotechnology can sort of unlock that potential.
That's right.
So for some of our network who might be less familiar with your work, I know you went into the sort of approach that you take at Checkerspot to how you're working, but could you tell a bit more about what is it that you specifically do? So it's like a whole cycle from design up to the creation of a product, but could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Again, it starts with the cornerstone of our platform, and that is biotechnology. And we're utilizing microalgae, which is the primordial cell type that gave rise to all plant life. And that's important for a reason that I'll get to in just a second. But what we're fundamentally able to do is access a natural biodiversity of monomers, oils, triglycerides, proteins, as examples, that are produced by plants on the earth today, but have never been able to be accessed at scale. In other words, you can't grow them in the arable regions of the world. They're available only at small scale, and therefore been neglected by big chemical providers, big materials suppliers. Biotechnology unlocks this ability to access that biodiversity, but to produce through a fermentation-based process at very, very large scale. And that's what's unique and differentiated. We can get to these performance materials.
Right. And so is there some sort of modification of the organ or the microalgae that you use in this process, or is it just fermenting these specific types of algae to get more of this?
It depends on what we're trying to solve for. We use both natural strains of microalgae. We also use strains that we use classical means of modification. Specifically, I'm referring to something called mutagenesis, which is leveraging ultraviolet light and other chemical means to precipitate genetic changes in the strains. And then we also use tools of genetic engineering to incorporate genes from certain plants, some higher plants, into the microalgae.
All right. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. But yeah, you were mentioning that you use this microalgae as your main feedstock. Why have you chosen to do that? I know you mentioned a little bit about it's one of the initial building blocks, and that there's a lot of biodiversity that can be unlocked through it. But what specifically drew you to this?
Well, if you think about how I framed and talked about what we're doing relative to how so many materials and ingredients that are used in consumer products, where they come from, specifically petroleum and commodity-based vegetable oils. First, it's important to remember that petroleum that we pull from the earth, crude oil, is fossilized, plant-based, and animal-based oils that have been sitting there for billions of years that we pull from the earth. If you recall from your basic high school level biology class, microalgae was the first unicellular plant organism that gave rise to all plant life. And so over the millennia, these microalgae naturally evolved to produce oil for energy, and over time became fossilized. So one way to think about what we're doing is accelerating the process to get to oils by leveraging microalgae through fermentation relative to the billions of years that it's been sitting there and we extract as petroleum. In contrast, the other example that I gave with commodity vegetable oils, palm oil as an example, we are leveraging a unicellular organism that gave rise to all higher plants. And that's important when we think about genetic engineering. The pathways, the biological pathways to produce triglycerides that exist within microalgae that then evolved into all of the higher plants is one and the same. And that's important when we think about the genetic changes that we can affect, because we're just coaxing our strains of microalgae in subtle ways to produce specific point molecules, triglycerides, that plants have evolved to want to produce. And that's really important because that allows the scale up of the technology to big commercial and industrial scale, because the cells want to produce these point molecules. And that's very different than, for example, trying to engineer something, a cell type, to produce a molecule that it wasn't evolved or intended to produce, which can often be toxic and therefore doesn't scale. And so we're really leaning into what biology has evolved to produce, and just coaxing it to produce certain other types of materials and ingredients.
Yeah, I think that's really great to put. I think there are a lot of associations that people have with any kind of modification, especially of an organism, is that it's somehow unnatural. And so I think it's a wonderful way of seeing it, is that you're more like leaning into, as you say, what nature already does, and just trying to amplify that rather than, do something completely opposite to it.
Yeah, and Cindy, that's one of the reasons that we named the company Checkerspot. I mean, first and foremost, we recognize that the Edith Checkerspot butterfly was being negatively impacted by climate change, and everything that we're doing is anchored around a call to action for sustainability. But more to the point, we also recognize that Mother Nature has just delivered exquisite structure and function. Mother Nature is the best designer. And we're really leaning into that by finding ways to work with Mother Nature as opposed to working against Mother Nature.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a great way to kind of anchor your work around. So one of the things that you say that you have this microalgae that you then coax to make essentially more of a oil, and then you use that oil for a variety of different products. One of these products that you have commercially is a ski. I was wondering why you started making skis. What brought you to that?
Well, the first thing I have to acknowledge is that I'm an outdoor enthusiast, and so there was a personal passion around skiing. But that's not a good business rationale to select a certain application type to bring to market. Yeah. The real reason is because when we looked and surveyed all of the hundreds, if not thousands, of markets where oils are being utilized in materials and ingredients, we wanted to identify markets that, number one, were underserved. And although outdoor recreation as a market is a multi-billion-dollar market, it's not what groups normally associate with the most extraordinarily large materials markets. And I'm thinking like aerospace and building materials, automotive as examples. And so the outdoor recreation industry has surprisingly been underserved by the chemical industry. And it's also a category where the performance of the materials really matter, and where the consumers are demanding performance materials. And that dissonance, consumers demanding performance materials and the market really underserving the delivery of new performance materials, seemed very intriguing. And then we also recognize that some of the materials utilized in outdoor recreation, in the instance that we've initially brought to market, a urethane-based composite that we've engineered into skis, that same urethane-based composite has application in the automotive industry. And so being able to enter into the market in an application that we have deep passion and conviction around, showcase what's possible with the performance material, develop the narrative, prove the supply chain, demonstrate actual cost of goods, create the data sets, that all of these elements serve to support and accelerate entering into much larger markets that have arguably bigger impact. The last point that I think is important to mention is, again, so much of what we're doing is anchored around doing better things for the planet and viewing sustainability as a design constraint. And the outdoor recreation consumer, by definition, has a love for the outdoors, has a love for nature and protecting the earth. And so it was a really natural place for us to ultimately define as our point of entry into the market.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really encouraging to see that, you know, you've designed a material for one purpose, but then you're finding all these other applications as well, or potential applications. So there is clearly a lot of innovation, and it's exciting to hear that, you know, there's a number of different things that you're working on in Checkerspot as well. But what do you see as changing in the current climate? Why are more people interested in bio-based products?
I think more people are interested in bio-based products because I think there's an increasing level of appreciation for the need to protect the planet. I think I would love to be there in person with you right now, Cindy, but we're in the midst of a global pandemic.
Right.
And this global pandemic, if anything, is amplifying how tightly knit the global community is and how much science matters. Even though you can't see the virus, we know that biology can have an enormous impact. And when we think about things like sustainability and we think about climate change, I think consumers are increasingly aware that this matters, and that consumers have an enormous amount of power in terms of where they decide to buy product, where their dollars and cents are allocated towards. We also remarked as we were preparing to begin the session that outside my window, we're sort of choking on smoke. There's multiple wildfires burning in California right now as a consequence of climate change. That is very visible. And I think there's an increasing awareness for why the decisions we make, the behaviors that we adopt as consumers has a global impact. And that awareness, that desire to do better translates to demand. And there are a number of groups, including some of the biggest chemical companies in the world, like our partners Gore, or like our partners the DIC Corporation in Tokyo, that are making investments and helping to support better models of bringing performance materials to market.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're completely right, especially with the current pandemic that's highlighted, I think, a lot of these global issues. So yeah, but with this heightened concern for the environment, how do you see the circular economy playing into this? How do you see bio-based materials interacting with this new type of an economy?
I think that it comes back to one of the points I tried to articulate earlier around the importance of design constraints and tackling product development through a lens of design thinking. And for instance, we're currently working on a project involving using a resin system that is soluble in ski building. And the reason that is so intriguing to us is because by leveraging this resin system that is soluble, we can potentially be taking back products, or at a minimum using the waste streams from the manufacturing process and pulling the materials apart to utilize them in other applications. So thinking about not just in a very linear sense, taking a material, building something, or creating a waste stream that then ultimately at the end of life goes to landfill, but instead to think about how can we take products apart, how can we reutilize materials and feedstocks and waste streams to create value and minimize waste. So we're actively investing through this design thinking methodology ways to consider circularity.
Great. That's wonderful to hear that you're taking that into account, and look forward to seeing how you develop in that journey.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charles, for your time today. It was wonderful to hear some insights from you.
Cindy, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. As we've heard from both of our speakers today, the area of bio-based materials is quickly gaining traction. There's a lot of innovation already happening, both in terms of different feedstocks being used for the production of material, as well as the processes, with both conventional chemistry as well as more novel biotechnological processes playing a role. However, we do still see some misconceptions around what exactly is meant by bio-based materials and what conditions are needed to ensure that these materials have the beneficial impact on, for instance, the environment that we hope for them to. System level and circular thinking are thus needed to ensure that we can create a circular materials economy that is both thriving and able to operate within the means of our planet, while also satisfying our ever-growing needs for materials. It's a complex and exciting field with lots of innovation potential, and we at the Foundation look forward to keeping a keen eye on how this field develops. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at the Summit 2020 by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation.